Hello and welcome to Newscentre. I'm Parikshit Luthra. After 7 months, India has a full-time chairperson for the Competition Commission. Ravneet Kaur has become the first woman to head the CCI, a 1988 batch IS officer from Punjab cadre. Ravneet Kaur will be at the helm of the competition watchdog for a period of 5 years. Her appointment comes at a crucial time as the organisation has more than 250 pending cases related to anti-profiteering and antitrust. Kaur's responsibility will include overseeing the implementation of the Competition Act. She will also serve as a member of the Committee on Digital Competition Law. To discuss this further, we're now joined by Sameer Gandhi, partner at Axiom Partners. Mr. Gandhi, thank you very much for joining us here on CNBC-TV18. We do get a sense that over the last 7 months, M&As were held up, but that process was eased up a little bit because the government waived off the quorum requirement. Give us a sense of how the Indian industry has been affected over the last 7 months because of not having a chairperson at the CCI and the kind of cases that have piled up over the last few weeks.
Thanks, Parikshit. And look, let me start by saying that it's a fantastic development. I'm personally and professionally very pleased that the government has appointed Ms. Kaur to the position of the chairperson. This position is pivotal for the functioning of the CCI, as you mentioned, not least because of the imminent changes that are going to be implemented to the Competition Act. The Act has just been amended. It has received presidential assent. So we're in the run-up to actually almost a brand new competition law. I think apart from the first task that she will have on her plate to implement this newly framed amended law, she is also going to need to deal with some serious cartel cases, including, for example, the cement cartel, which is pending disposal, a whole lot of investigations which have been piled up and have been languishing for want of quorum of the Competition Commission. And on the M&A side, I think the Commission has done a fantastic job only because aided by the invocation of the doctrine of necessity, it has gone ahead and cleared a number of merger proposals. But there again, there have been some questions asked about the more tricky merger proposals, which the Commission has cleared. There has been some litigation before the High Courts, which have questioned the authority or the invocation of the doctrine of necessity on the merger control front. So all in all, Parikshit, a pretty messy situation for the Commission to be in. It's done the best it could possibly do. With Mrs. Kaur's appointment, I'm very hopeful that we're going to see renewed and invigorated enforcement by the CCI.
Right. Also, when it comes to abuse of market dominance by big tech, investigations against startups, so what kind of regulatory clarity that you're expecting from the antitrust regulator when it comes to investigations against startups, investigations against big tech, which is pending?
Absolutely, Parikshit. I think one of the key areas in which the Competition Commission has focused its attention in the course of the last couple of years has been on abuse of dominance investigations against large technology companies, platforms. So some of these are ongoing, and some of these investigations, I think, will now start to move beyond simply, investigation stage, and the Commission will have a chance to adjudicate upon some of these. Others, I think, will benefit greatly from the new settlement and commitment process, which will kick in once the new act is actually enforced. So again, I'm hopeful that the chairperson will use all the powers available to her in this new competition amendment bill or amendment act now to be able to hasten the enforcement of antitrust cases, including those against big tech companies, startups, so on and so forth, but pretty much across the board, Parikshit. So I think that while the focus will be, I'm no doubt, on big tech as well as on startups, but I think these powers that are now available to the new chairperson and to the competition agency as a whole, this is the perfect time to actually test them, to put them into place. So it's a real opportunity for a reset. She has a full 5 years, which is also a tremendous advantage. It's unprecedented, Parikshit. No other chairperson of the Competition Commission since 2009 has had full 5 years to go ahead.
Right. The other question, how important is it for the Competition Commission to have a full quorum of members. Currently, yes, the minimum requirement will be met once Ravneet Kaur joins and takes over as CCI chairperson. That will be a total of 3 minimum members. But what about the other members? The CCI had advertised for the position. I think the applications are invited till the first week of May, and in the next few weeks, we'll have clarity on whether and when more members will be inducted. How is that important for the CCI, considering the load, considering the pendency of cases and the kind of transition it's going through?
Thanks, Parikshit. I think in a moment like this, more is merrier. So I think having a few more members as part of the commission will definitely help. Bear in mind that the commission does take decisions as a whole. The quorum rule is the bare minimum, right? Which is you need 3 members present for a validly constituted meeting of the commission. So I think that for the time being, to have the chairperson to be able to complete quorum is fantastic. Bear in mind also that some of the existing members of the commission are going to superannuate in the next 3 or 4 months. So honestly, I think the process for appointments of the new members needs to be put onto a fast track. We will greatly benefit from having more members on board, but equally we will benefit from a continued quorum, of having at least 3 members once the existing members also superannuate towards the end of the year. So I think it's all in all a good thing that this process has started and moving along.
All right. Thanks very much, Sameer, for joining us, giving us your view on the appointment of the new chairperson, the first woman chairperson of the Competition Commission of India. And this is a time when India is also working and has set up a committee to look into the possibility of a digital competition law. And Ravneet Kaur will also be a part of that body. Thanks very much, Sameer, for joining us here on CNBC TV18. Moving on, and let's focus on the G7 currently. G7 nations are set to meet in Japan later this week. The leaders are expected to discuss issues ranging from energy, Russia-Ukraine war, and China's economic coercion. The summit is also likely to see a joint statement by members on China's use of economic leverage abroad and tools to counter it. I caught up with Joseph Turigian, Global Fellow of Public Policy at Wilson Center, on the key issues at the upcoming G7, and began by asking him how countries will push back on economic coercion by China. Take a look.
We've already had preparatory meetings of foreign ministers and financial ministers that indicate a major topic for the summit this weekend will be Chinese economic coercion. Apparently, there will also be a special joint statement about this kind of coercion, although China will not be named in particular. It will be portrayed as a general statement, but of course, everybody will be having China on their minds.
Right. To what extent would the G7 like to contain China? And when we speak about economic coercion, their attempts at economic dominance, what exactly would countries like the United States want to check and put on the table?
So apparently the United States wanted to include a statement about investment into China, that G7 countries wouldn't invest in things like AI and semiconductors. But U.S. allies were skeptical about that. The European Union still talks about strategic autonomy. It's worried about the rise of China, but it also doesn't want the G7 to become an anti-China bloc.
I would also like to ask you, how much support did the U.S. really have for its policies, for its attempts to check China at the G7?
Well, Japan, who is hosting this event, they have had personal experiences with regards to China's economic coercion. Famously, a few years ago, China banned the export of rare earths to Japan. And certain European countries have been targeted by China, and Australia, of course, faced the repercussions from China across a whole slew of different exports. Canadian canola oil also was affected when they arrested a Huawei executive. But at the same time, a lot of the members of the G7 have extensive economic ties with China, and they'll be careful about not risking them in fundamental ways, even as they think about how they might be able to protect themselves from economic coercion.
Right. In the last few days, we have seen reports about how China's Xi Jinping has asked the military to prepare to invade Taiwan by 2027. Could such an invasion happen earlier, and what could prompt it?
Well, the 2027 deadline that you just mentioned, it isn't an explicit statement that China will invade Taiwan in 2027. I don't think that there's any country in the world that tells its military that it doesn't need to be prepared for war. I think that China has good reasons to try to avoid fighting in the Taiwan Straits. I think that they understand that a war could be disastrous for them. At the same time, I think that the situation is not stable. Both China and the United States thinks that the other side is unilaterally changing the status quo. And when the United States takes steps that upsets China, Beijing feels a need to create repercussions. And sometimes those repercussions can be dangerous. For example, the military exercises that were conducted last year, something goes wrong in a situation like that, the situation could very easily slip out of control.
India has been locked in a border dispute with China since 2019, since the Galwan clashes, and the military preparedness on both sides remains at the highest level. Can anything really change China's stance?
Well, to solve the border problem between India and China, it would require political will and trust on both sides for a give and take process. But I think that especially after the Galwan incident in 2020 that you just mentioned, those conditions are not present. Furthermore, China, I think, might find an unresolved border useful to them because it allows them to put pressure on the Indians whenever they want to and to remind them of the costs that they can impose if India gets too close to the Quad and the United States in particular. At the same time, I don't think that China wants a war with India. We've seen over the last few years still some incidents, but not deaths like we saw in 2020. So China, I think, will want to be able to put pressure on India, but also will understand that going too far may push India in a direction that China does not want.
Right. Finally, when it comes to launching of reforms, the kind of reforms and the kind of vision that Xi Jinping has, very recently we have seen a launch of a pilot project across 20 cities that aims to create a new era for marriage and childbearing for the future. This is to tackle the country's falling birth rate. How do you see this measure that has been adopted by the Chinese government? What are some of the other reform measures that countries like India will have to watch out for?
Well, this is certainly a very interesting question. We've seen demographics take headlines in a way that we haven't previously. This is the first year that China's population has decreased since the famine of the Great Leap Forward during the Mao Zedong era. And we've also seen this year that India is becoming the world's largest population. So asking about what China might do to address its own demographic crisis, which will have implications for the entire world, is something that we should look at. So it's not surprising that we would see the policies that you just described. However, as we know from people that study demographic issues, solving that kind of crisis isn't as easy as introducing a few new policies. At the very heart of the problem is the simple fact that Chinese families don't want to have children. And the reason for that is housing is very expensive, education is very expensive, the social safety net remains weak as China is a middle-income country. So whether or not they will be able to fix those structural problems is something that we'll have to keep an eye out for.
All right. And finally, India at this juncture is trying to attract global supply chains, is attracting manufacturers, encouraging many to take advantage of India when it comes to the China Plus One strategy. What kind of tensions could there be between India and China as a result of these attempts to bring manufacturing, bring companies who are thinking of an alternative to China to India?
So business people in China used to have the idea that they needed to be there. And I think that mindset hasn't changed, but has been modified because of a view that they need to have redundancies. They need to have a backup. There are multiple reasons for that. One of those reasons was the zero COVID lockdown. One of those reasons a sense that Xi Jinping prioritizes security over development. We've seen just recently, over the last few weeks, a crackdown in China on consultants who go to that country to do due diligence so that outsiders know what they're getting into. India has been able to take advantage of this so-called China plus one strategy. India has its own challenges, of course, with regards to bureaucracy and infrastructure, although India has expressed the desire to resolve those challenges. So what that means exactly for India-China relations, I'm not sure, but I think that both of them will look very carefully to see what kind of advantages they'll be able to seize as these companies are trying to maneuver the conditions that I just described for you.
All right, do watch out for our special coverage on the G7 starting this Friday. We're heading into a short break, but coming up, companies could soon find it easier to liquidate outside the insolvency and bankruptcy process. Discussion with Rudra Kumar Pandey, partner at Shardul Amarchand Mangaldas, when we're back. Welcome back. You're watching Newscentre. Companies could soon find it easier to liquidate outside the insolvency and bankruptcy process. This after the centre amended the Companies Amalgamations Arrangements Compromises Rules 2016. Under the new rules, the government can issue a no-objection certificate to the liquidation of a company if it is suggested by the registrar and liquidator in 30 days. The government can also issue an NOC within 15 days after the expiry of 30 days given to the registrar and liquidator. Moreover, the scheme will be considered approved if the government doesn't issue an order within 60 days. Let me now go across to Rudra Pandey of Shardul Amarchand Mangaldas. Rudra Pandey, thank you very much for joining us. Give us a sense of what section of companies will benefit from this easier process.
Thank you, Parikshit, for having me. Let me tell you that basically Rule 25, Sub-Rule 5 and Sub-Rule 6 have been amended by Ministry of Corporate Affairs, largely due to the fact that despite Section 233 talks about fast-track merger, in terms of the procedural delay at the ROC and RD level, the company was not being merged or amalgamated in a timely manner, and therefore this deeming provision has been incorporated in the said rules. Now, the benefit will go to largely the startups when they are merging into, say, group companies of that group of the startup companies, or the startup company and the small companies, and the wholly owned subsidiaries with the holding company. So largely three buckets, and of course the last bucket is the small companies, between the small companies. This is not meant to be for the larger corporates. This is meant to be for a smaller company and a startup company in that sense.
Right. Rudra Pandey, I'd also like to ask you, what was the earlier timeline for mergers, and to what extent has this been cut down?
So the timeline is still the same, actually. The only concept that they have amended in Rule 5, Sub-Rule 5 and Sub-Rule 6 is a deeming provision, wherein, so basically how the process works, when a company is intending to do a fast-track merger, they need to issue a notice in a prescribed form to ROC and basically to the MCA. ROC and OL, which is the official liquidator, they need to give their objections to that amalgamation proposal to the regional director called RD. So this entire process of the objection need to be completed within 30 days. And then once the objection is given or no objection is given, the RD need to give a confirmation that they are fine with the fast-track merger scheme. Now, what was happening is that ROC was taking time and also RD was taking time. And therefore, this deeming provision will help basically the whole purpose of fast-track can be achieved, which is essentially within 60 days, the entire merger will need to be approved or confirmed. If not, if they are not doing anything, I mean, in the sense they are not confirming in a prescribed form, if they have an objection, they need to apply to the NCLT to bring the 233 merger scheme under 232 scheme. So basically, deeming provision will help cut down the procedural timeline.
Right. Finally, does this help liquidation of cases pending in the NCLT outside the IBC framework?
No, this will not help the IBC process actually, because this has nothing to do with the IBC process. That will be driven by the IBC processing. I'm not the IBC expert, but to the best of my knowledge, that's a different process. This is largely to benefit the startup, the smaller companies, and merging the wholly owned subsidiary with the holding company. Nothing beyond that.
Right. And finally, when it comes to mergers in small subsidiaries of large companies or with regard to startups, are there any other pending issues which are on the anvil, according to you?
Yeah, so there's one issue where, like supposingly you have a holding company in a different registrar or jurisdiction, and the wholly owned subsidiaries in a different ROC jurisdiction. So then there are two separate applications need to be filed. We had recommended, and the MCA is considering if there can be one composite applications, but that is a very minor issue. Largely the timeline is the key issue, because the whole concept of fast-track merger was not achieved, which with this process deeming provision, we are sure a great initiative by Ministry of Corporate Affairs will address the key concern from the industry side.
All right, Ruta Kumar Pandey, thank you very much for joining us here, giving us your views on the changes that have been made as far as the amalgamation and merger of companies is concerned. That's all we have time for here on Newscentre. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.